Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to Southwark Cathedral for what I think will be both a fun and a thought-provoking evening. This week sees the 100th anniversary of the birth of the actor, comedian and broadcaster Kenneth Williams. He was, as you know, an extraordinary man. He was gifted, he was funny, he was reflective, he was somewhat tortured perhaps, and for the first time recently, recordings of readings of some gospel stories read by Kenneth have been unearthed, and some can be heard this week on 5 BBC Radio 4 Extra daily services, which I really enjoyed putting together, and also in a programme which somebody's just mentioned, you can still hear on BBC Sounds, called Said the Actor to the Bishop. And you will hear how those recordings came about of Kenneth reading these stories from the Gospels. I think it's fair to say that Kenneth, who I knew for the last few months of his life, was a man for all seasons of the spirit, from outrageous histrionics and the double entendre to ennui and the autumnal melancholic soul. He was known and loved for his voice, for his anecdotes, his campery on Round the Horn and in the Carry-Ons, and for his storytelling on Jackanory and Will-o'-the-Wisp. And those recordings of the gospel stories has reminded people that his Christian faith was important to him, and that hasn't always been explored in the past. It's always him with matron, or him, the tortured, solitary person walking around his old school and so on. But it was an important part of him, and so here we are to do exactly that, and I'm doing it with another two equally extraordinary people. Gyles Brandreth needs very little introduction to you, a multi-talented broadcaster, writer, former politician. He has worked as a television presenter, theatre producer, journalist, author, publisher, known for his knitwear and naughtiness. He too, I feel, is a man for all seasons, and his writing stretches across many genres, from poetry anthologies, guides to grammar, histories, diaries, a biography of the Queen and of Prince Philip, and his most recent book, just out, Somewhere a Boy and a Bear, A. Milne and the Creation of Winnie the Pooh. He is a national Swiss Army knife, ready to do anything and always do it well. He knew Kenneth Williams and often contributes to programmes made on Kenneth, and I've known Gyles for a few years now, and it is wonderful to welcome you here and to hear your reflections on the man and his faith. Bill Holland didn't know Kenneth personally, but my goodness knows a hell of a lot about him, and he's put this to creative purpose in publishing his recent book, Beyond Our Kenneth, the Continued Diaries of Kenneth Williams, in which he imagines another reality where Kenneth, instead of dying in 1988, continues his life and career into the early 1990s, navigating life and work in a changing London. Bill says he was motivated by the persistent thought that Williams's story deserved a final act. Before writing, Bill was an actor, and his interests range from the Olympic Games to British sitcoms to the Whitechapel murders to English royalty, numismatics and the Eurovision Song Contest. So lots to talk about if we run out of ideas on Kenneth, which we won't do. Would you, before we begin, please welcome Gyles and Bill. Let me just tell you how the evening will pan out, hopefully. I will hand over to both Gyles and Bill, who will stand here very briefly and just tell you a little bit about their relationship to Kenneth Williams and how they knew him or knew of him and so on. After that, Bill has put together a few clips of Kenneth Williams talking about the subject that we're picking up here today, about his faith and about his religious commitments and background and so on. Then we'll have a little bit of a conversation here about things that have emerged from those clips. Then we'll ask if you have any comments or questions. And then we'll end with a final clip, which we believe hasn't been seen since...
Not in its entirety. I don't think it will have been seen since 1976, I don't think.
1976. We're leading the way in the Church of England, as you know, here. It hasn't been seen since 1976. And it's Kenneth talking about exactly what we will have talked about, his faith and how he sees and understands faith. And then, after we've seen that clip, there will be an opportunity to buy books by Gyles and Bill, and they very kindly said that they will sign those for you should you wish. So before I just hand over to Gyles, I'll just very quickly tell you how I met Kenneth Williams. I was a student in London University, and I was wowed by being in London because I'm a Shropshire lad and London felt very fresh and new. And I thought I'd invite the one person I always wanted to meet to come and speak to our Christmas dinner at university. And I wrote to him, and he very kindly wrote back in that beautifully immaculate hand. And he said no. And he said no in a very nice way, but he said no. And about 3 days after that, I was walking up to a theology bookshop that used to be on the Marrowbone Road, and just by Osnaburg Street where he lived, and I saw him in the distance. And I just caught up with him and pretended I was just bumping into him. And I said, "Oh, thank you for your letter you've just written to me." And he said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Well, I'm going to Woolies to buy a pen. Do you want to come?" So I said, "Yeah, okay." So we walked to Woolies and bought the pen, and we walked back again, and outside the door of his apartment block, he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I lied because I had about 4 lectures to go to. I said, "Oh, nothing. And he said, "Do you want lunch? Vecchia Milana, Oxford Street, 12:30. I didn't know what was going on, really. This just seemed too good to be true, but I turned up in my best tie and slightly overdressed. And there he was. And we had lunch, and we talked about all the things that we loved, shared love. Philip Larkin, I remember he was talking a lot about. And at the end of it, he said, "Well, it'd be nice to do this again." And about every 3 weeks or so, we would just have lunch and chat. And in the diaries, after meeting me that first time, he says he has a very ambiguous sense of vocation. I'll leave that with the congregation members here tonight as to how accurate that is. But that's how I knew him and how I got to know him. Gyles, would you tell us how you got to know him and your relationship with him?
Well, 2 things to thank you for, Mark. One, on behalf of Kenneth, I think you actually played an important part in the end of his life. So well done. And thank you for inviting Bill and me and all these lovely people here today and mentioning that we would be pleased to sign our books. We are desperate to sign our books. We haven't just come here to pass among you so we may touch our garb. We have come here because we have books to flog. His book is very good. Mine are many and splendid. I brought my wife along as well to explain to you why we need to sell the books. We have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and we discovered over the years that we need the money because money is the one thing keeping us in touch with them. And being sort of middle-class types, we're trying to help our children with the school fees. So we would like to sell 20% more books than we did when we last came here a couple of years ago. Any help we can receive from you will be gratefully received. I'm thrilled to be here talking about Kenneth, and I must try and stop myself from being moved, because I can imagine how moved he would have been without showing it, that you people have gathered here. He would be making us all laugh by saying he was a cult. I'm a cult. You know, in an upstairs room at Southwark Cathedral, there would be these motley crew have gathered. And this ambiguous cleric has come with his partner. And he'd be being funny in here, but he'd go away and he would be so thrilled that you do him this great honour. And also that you are clearly people who've come here because you see in this interesting, wonderful performer something more than the obvious. And of course, his fame rests on the obvious, which he did better than anybody else. Why do we remember him? Because he was unique. He had all the qualities that the great John Gielgud described in having star quality, which really included an idiosyncrasy, an ability to be a unique person, a quality of voice that was unusual, an ability to move elegantly, to assume other roles while at the same time not losing the truth of yourself. All these things that Gielgud described as essential to be a star, as opposed to just a very good performer or a very considerable actor. To have that star quality that people look at you when you come onto the stage. Kenneth had all those in abundance, and he had them in abundance really right from the start. I'm sure, will be touching on his extraordinary career over the years and some of the regrets he had over the years. But you asked me to tell you how I first got to know Kenneth. Well, obviously, as a child, I heard him on the radio, listening to Hancock's Half Hour on the radio, listening to Beyond Our Ken and Take It From Here. So I first heard his voice, being a home service listener and a light program listener in the 1950s. And I saw him on television in Hancock's Half Hour. And then as I grew older, I saw him in the Carry On films and all of that. So that when in the 1970s, I think I did first write to him when I was president of the Union, the Debating Society at Oxford University, and I wrote to him asking him, as you did, to come and speak at the university. And I got the first of those elegant letters and that beautiful hand. He had trained as a calligrapher, and his handwriting was lovely, and he wrote in proper ink, and we've all kept the letters. That's why there could be a collection of the letters of Kenneth Williams, because everybody kept them, rather as everybody knew to keep the letters of Oscar Wilde. Interesting that sometimes people, before they're famous, people know they're special, and they keep their letters. Anyway, I wrote to him. I got the very nice letter saying, thank you, but no thank you. But at least I had the address, which was useful. Because a few years later, Michelle, my wife, and we sort of, in a sense, invented the phenomenon of the celebrity book. And we had some huge successes. We did a book with Michael Caine called Not a Lot of People Know That, which was a good title. And Michael Caine very sweetly agreed to put his name to the book, and it became a #1 bestseller. The idea came because Michael Caine shares a birthday with my wife, Michelle, and with Albert Einstein. Not a lot of people know that. It was a funny story, and it's irrelevant to Kenneth because they were to do with the money. We earned £70,000 in royalties for the charity that Michael Caine had designated, and the publisher could not let go of this money. It's such a lot of money. And eventually I got an event that Michael Caine came to, and the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, came to, and I got the publisher to come with this £70,000. Can I borrow a piece of your paper here? Just one sheet. This is the cheque. Would you? I'm the publisher giving the cheque to the Princess Royal, £70,000, given by Michael Caine, his royalties for this book. We're talking about the 1970s. It's a huge amount of money then. You are the Princess Royal. I am the publisher. And I'm Gyles, also forcing the publisher's hand towards the Princess Royal. Please take the cheque. Take the cheque. Take the cheque. Take the cheque. The man eventually let go of it, and he then just went away and sort of stood in a corner, almost weeping. Anyway, we were looking for famous people who might lend their names to books. And I, in a taxi, had an idea for a book by Kenneth Williams. I just had the title, came into my head, Acid Drops. I just thought, this is it. Kenneth can do acid drops, acid drops. As with Michael Caine, I thought, we'll write the book, he gives the title, he gets the royalties, he can either keep them or give them to charity. Yay! So I found the address, and I wrote to Kenneth Williams. I said, this is the idea, this is what the book will contain. What do you think? Anyway, he replied and said we should meet. And then it was like your encounter. Bless your heart, saying, why do you think he said meet you at 12:30 for lunch? And then see you next Tuesday. It's because we were young.
Yes.
And automatically, when you're young, you are attractive. And Kenneth liked attractive young people. Actually, young women, young men. He just liked being with young people. And if you are, as you were, God, time has been cruel to both of us. We were of a similar age. This was just a few years before you passed it. Anyway, we met and we went to a restaurant called Odin's, which was not far from where he lived, off Baker Street, because we were then living off Baker Street. And we hit it off immediately. Partly, well, not because I knew all his famous work, but because I knew his other work. And so I knew he'd been in the Beggar's Opera with Laurence Olivier. I knew he'd played the Dauphin in St. Joan. I knew he'd been in Orson Welles' company at the Royal Court in Moby Dick. And he was pleased that I knew all of that. And so we got on famously. And over the next few years, we became really good friends. And he was a good friend to us, to Michelle, and to our children, all of whom loved him, though we may, I think, later come on to the downside, the dark side, the sad side, some of which was instigated by our children, because we had very small children then, and neither of us liked the small children and Kenneth smoking. And Kenneth was an inveterate smoker, and it became quite an issue. It was fine when he came to supper or dinner because the children had gone to bed. But when he came to write one of his books with us, with me, we didn't want him smoking in the house while the children were around. And that was infuriating to him. And it was the beginning of, I think, really a sort of wedge between us. Anyway, we became friends, and essentially we worked together on all his books. So all the books that Kenneth Williams wrote the first one was written, as it were, with me and partly by me, which was Acid Drops. I'm proud to say I was actually in the room when this photograph was taken. A lot of stop mucking about was going on, but anyway, there he is. And so we became really part and parcel of each other's lives. And he was a wonderful person in the sense that he was kind to us. He was very kind to us. He was very kind to me, for example, when my father died. My father died quite young. He wrote me a lovely, lovely letter, basically the last words of which I can recall. The last words were, "To endure is all." And I will do my best not to get too emotionally engaged in this, but indebtedness to him is very great. And therefore our regret at the ending of his life is also very great. We'll come on to that. But the highs included him coming round and being huge fun. He was very variable. He could be in a mood where he was wanting to be a little bit down, a little bit philosophic, and he would talk far too fast. He was also autodidactic, and he was conscious he was with people who were obviously educated, given that we were both recently down from Oxford University. So he somehow sometimes overdid the sharing of knowledge. But he knew much more than us. He knew much more poetry than us, and he would recite poems to us. And so we'd have serious side of Kenneth, but we'd also have hilarious side of Kenneth. This is over 10 or 12 years, we would give regular dinner parties. We were young and full of energy. This is before we discovered cook and putting a meal into the microwave, and it's done in 30 seconds, stir, 45 seconds, ready. And then sit down, watch Bargain Hunt, and that's the evening. In younger and happier days, we would give dinner parties, and we would build them around Kenneth. And he came and he performed, and he was wonderful. The downside, we can talk about a little bit later. But he was wonderful. And he would always come when he did a Parkinson, which we recorded earlier in the evening. We lived nearby, and he would come afterwards, and we'd watch it with him, and we would say all the right things to him. So what I really want to do as I introduce, and we knew him well, and we'll say lots of things as they come out, but what I really want to say is it's marvelous that we're here. We're going to talk about the difficult journey of his life. We're also going to talk about his faith. I shall be telling you about the sad times, having said about the glorious times. But really what I want to do is to begin by saying how wonderful it is that we are gathered here to salute his genius, because he had a genius. Not many performers, on a handful of performers, are alive, their voices are alive, their character, their personality, their work is alive 2 generations after their death. Of the great Victorian entertainers, you may remember the name of Murray Lloyd. Just. Dan Leno, probably not at all. But he was up there in that sphere, and he is still with us. Not only because we can see his performance, you can see a lot of performances from people of that generation, but because there was something about him that was mesmerizing, fascinating, funny, and yet complicated at the same time, really interesting. He was a star personality. You're going to see him, and you're going to be almost able to hear him, because our mutual friend David Benson is here tonight, and I think he's going to give us some readings from the diaries that you have chosen. So all I want to say as I sit down is, well done you coming to salute the cult. So can we, just because he'll be up there pretending not to listen. Actually, he's happier now because Stanley Baxter is now up there with him. So he is the complete family. He did have a family. Stanley Baxter, Gordon Jackson, and their wives were his family. We were secondary family. They were the main family. So he's up there with family. So he's all right. But can we just do one loud hurrah as we applaud the cult that was Kenneth Williams? We're here. Cultists. Bravo!
Well, thank you, Gyles, and follow that, as they always. Thank you very much. I'd like to say, first of all, in great Kenneth Williams style, may I say what an honour it is for you to have us. And my name is Bill Holland, and I am, as Mark said, the author of a book called Beyond Our Kenneth, the Continued Diaries of Kenneth Williams, which is an obvious title for a sort of wannabe J.K. Rowling, you know. It's the next big thing, obviously. But it's slightly a niche idea. But I had the idea because I'm a huge fan, like many of us in this room, a huge fan of the great man Kenneth Williams. Now, unlike my 2 colleagues who knew him and also were contemporaries, I was only 3.5 years old when he died, which sort of...
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Mark and I are very grateful for that.
Really good. But no, there was a point. There was a point to that. It's sort of latching on to what you were saying, Gyles, about how generations later, there's still this magic dust that surrounds him. And trying to put your finger exactly on why he should have that and his contemporaries might not is is difficult. But the fact is, in my early teens, I suppose, I was grabbed in the way that most people are through his body of work, which is Sunday afternoon or whatever they'll show, a carry-on film, and that's your kind of entry level to Kenneth Williams. And then you start to see other things that he did, hear radio broadcasts. The BBC, for all their faults, are still quite good at playing old things that were made 50, 60 years ago that people can listen to and become a fan of. But the second level of Kenneth Williams fandom is when you start to, I think, read the books, not only the books that Gyles worked on him with in terms of his entertainment books, if you want to put it like that, but when you start to look at the man himself and what he thought about himself, which obviously is his infamous diaries, which were published in an edited form in 1993, so 5 years after he died. I'm sure many of you will, if not have read them, will know about them. And they are, I'm biased, but I think some of the greatest diaries ever written by anybody. I think, you know, Pepys has his place, Virginia Woolf has her place, but Kenneth Williams is writing in the second half of the 20th century, arguably the most interesting time. He's an actor, he's gay, has suicidal tendencies. He, as we shall discover, is a man of deep faith, deep thinking. He's really, really intelligent, but self-taught. And once you start reading and are enjoying the bitchiness, cattiness of the diaries, and then you peel through the layers of this figure who, in my case, just fascinated me. I've got a copy here of the tome that is the Diaries of Kenneth Williams, which is actually only a fraction of what he wrote over a 40-year period in his diary. And this is my third paperback copy. The first I've kept, but it is sort of disintegrating because I've always had a copy by my side. It's the kind of, like any diary, you can dip in and out and find something that resonates or that makes you laugh, or especially with Kenneth Williams, can make you deeply thoughtful and upset, especially if you are reading some of the later entries where he was unwell, where his career was flagging, where, as Gyles alluded to, some friends were no longer calling back because of his behaviour, possibly. And it can really, really touch you. And that's what inspired me to write my book. I love the man. I think he was one of the funniest men this country's produced. But knowing more about him and knowing the personal feeling I do through his words in his writing just make him so much more of a rounded figure. And perhaps that is one of the reasons as to why he is still held in such esteem and such affection. But the reason we're here tonight is, as I said, he was a man who believed in God, had a Christian faith, and it was clearly very important to him. And I'm going to show you some clips now, mainly from chat shows where he alluded to this subject, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So if you could put the lights down.
Hi there. Unfortunately, we're unable to include the clip of Kenneth Williams in this podcast recording due to copyright restrictions. We apologise for the inconvenience caused and hope you enjoy the rest of the conversation.
So there are a few clips where Kenneth discusses faith from the beginning, from his upbringing as a Wesleyan, as he puts it, where they were shoved in with the Methodists, right up to a very late clip there, 1987, so months before he died, where he's clearly in a darker mood, reflective, talking about where dead men rise up never. And it's there's some funny clips in there. Obviously we laughed because he makes most things funny. But there were some times where he was saying some very serious things and people sat laughing because this is Kenneth Williams. But his faith, I think, illustrated in those clips, I hope you agree, that faith clearly was a big part of his life. And I think three of us now are going to discuss that.
Can I immediately throw in something? Just it was in my head off the back of that. And we'll come back to the faith. What's clear to me now, and I don't think I've thought about this before, is the love that he clearly wanted and needed and felt was so important. The love and through friendship became less available to him as the years went by. When he was younger, he was busier, he had more friends. As the years went by, he began to lose them. The work diminished. He still had his sister and love for her. He still had his mother and love for her, the love of his life in many ways, though she was more of a burden as the years went by. But he began to lose friends. And much of this was his own fault. In that, and I think it was fueled by drink. We can come on to that. But I remember we gave a dinner we had a great friend called John Schlesinger. We had two great friends, one called Noel Davis, who introduced us to John Schlesinger, who was a film director. John Schlesinger had been a friend of Kenneth's in the 1940s when they were in the Far East in the army, the days of Peter Nichols, Stanley Baxter, all of that. And they hadn't seen each other for years because they'd fallen out. Anyway, we had John Schlesinger, Noel Davis was a casting director, and Kenneth for supper in our kitchen. It went so well. It was John Schlesinger, a very distinguished film director, had tears rolling down his cheeks of laughter and of joy to be meeting Kenneth again. It was a happy, happy evening. And John decided to have a return match a month or two later at John's house in Kensington. Not a simple supper in the kitchen, unfortunately, but a larger dinner, maybe a dozen people, much grander, because he was grand. And it included other luminaries, including Alan Bennett. And the evening became a competition. He'd invited Kenneth, who he was in love with again, to come. And Kenneth came and was on song, but Alan Bennett was more droll, was quieter, wittier, and probably more sophisticated, as well-informed as Kenneth, and effortlessly beat Kenneth in every... He wasn't trying to play, he wasn't playing tennis, but Kenneth was batting away, and it was Alan Bennett's night, not Kenneth Williams' night. And as the evening wore on, Kenneth's behaviour became worse and worse. And so he lost John Schlesinger. He lost the potential of Alan Bennett as a friend. And this, towards the end of his life, as he's seeing this, love was everything to him. And it was disappearing. We last had him to a dinner party when it was our fault, really. We had a dozen people there. We had him, I suppose, as the show pony, I don't know. There were other distinguished people there. But we sat him next to, because he wanted to be next to the head of an Oxford college, a female head of an Oxford college. And he got more and more outrageous, and eventually, we're talking about the 1970s, 80s, to this head of an Oxford college, they were trying to have a conversation. He'd been talking about Shelley and all the rest. I suddenly, at their end of the table, I heard him speaking to this lady of some distinction and some age, and using the C word to her. And you can imagine the atmosphere in the room. And then we thought, well, what do we do? Do we ask him back next time? What happens? So that, I'm giving you the essence of where for him it went wrong. And I think what happened, and the diaries reflect this somewhat, is yes, he had faith, yes, he needed love, but as opportunities for love decreased, and as the work opportunities decreased, and he found himself angry with himself, because by telling stories, as Cyril Connolly said, the great talkers waste their lives on words that disappear into the air. As he was aware of all this, losing all that, drinking more, he was also spending more time alone. And as we know, to be happy, you've got to break the mirror. You've not got to think about yourself. You've got to, if you're lonely, you can talk to God, that's good, but you need friends to talk to as well. You need people to meet and fall in love with as well. So that, from those clips, that's the journey I've suddenly seen that I hadn't really seen before. He began to lose friendship, he began to lose love, he spent more time looking in the mirror.
Well, you mentioned, obviously, friends and relations there, and in terms of relatives, the big one, the relationship with his mother. And if we think of the first clip there, going back to the beginning of his life, talking about this Wesleyan upbringing. So his father, a strict Victorian man with this Welsh Wesleyan faith that clearly made a huge impression on Charlie Williams, who was Kenneth's father, made an impression on his son, because whatever his actions or whatever he did, he professed to have this religion for his entire life. So that's what I think, if you asked him, what is your faith? I think that's what he would say. And if he did take things from his father, and there's probably more things he took from his father than meets the eye, maybe, once you delve a bit deeper into his life, his religion is something he did take from his father. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Definitely. I mean, I think he was, I've used this before, so forgive me, but I think he was desperate to be looked at and terrified of being seen. And I've just been listening to his reading of The Prodigal Son, which was a story he often mentioned. And I think it's fascinating because it is a story about a father and his son. And those of you who know the story, the son goes up, there are two sons. One son goes off, takes all the inheritance, spends it all, ends up, there's a famine, everything goes wrong, he ends up eating pig food, and he decides he's going to go back and admit he did wrong. And before he can even get the words out, his father's run down the driveway and he's hugging him and he's saying, we've got to have a party. And there's the other son who's really not happy about this. Look what this son's done, and you're giving him a party. I've been here all the bloody time and you've never given me a thing. And as I listen to this, and he reads it in the most animated, emotionally engaged way, and I do, if you go to that programme, Said the Actor to the Bishop, you'll hear him read this. I think both sons were in him. There was the son who felt some shame for being gay, for the father who was very unhappy about that, although, of course, he thought secretly his father might have been gay himself. But so there was some shame maybe about who he was, but also I think about the cheapness of his profession, letting himself down by being, with the matron and and stop messing about. So going home at the end of the day, perhaps feeling he'd let himself down somehow. So that shame of the son who just wants to go home and be loved, but also the other son who's rather resentful and rather bitter and a bit jaundiced and acidic. And as you listen to him tell this story, I think you can feel both sides of Kenneth Williams in this story, which is about a very dominant father figure. I think it's fascinating.
And if you have this feeling within him, you get the result of that might be these feelings of guilt, which you talked about in the second clip there, and the way to deal with that, which is purging himself in different ways. As a friend of his, Gyles, were you aware that he would go home to his somewhat, and this is another kind of religious element of it, monastic type cell?
I must break a myth here.
Go on.
That he never allowed anybody into the bathroom or to use the loo.
Nonsense.
He did allow you into the bathroom. You could use the loo. Mm-hmm. I'm with you that he got a lot from his father. Mm-hmm. He paints his... he wrote his autobiography, which people don't read very much because the diaries are so much better written. He wrote his autobiography himself, and he came to our house and read page by page. And when he wrote about his father, he painted him as a bit of a caricature, the fierceness of his father. But it was clear that his father, there was a lot of his father in him. One of the things his father gave him, of course, was the permission to take his own life. If he did take his own life, we don't know. But he told me that his father had taken his own life, I don't think it is in the autobiography. He said he hadn't included it. And his father had a stash of poison, called it a stash of poison. And he told me, I have a stash of poison. Yes, one was aware that he was conflicted and that he had regrets, because he would write notes almost immediately apologizing. So a note would come the next day saying thank you.
So he felt guilt.
He felt guilt.
And he needed to.
Immediately he felt guilt. What we mustn't do, though, is make him into this tragic figure.
Sure.
I mean, I'm very conscious, because I'm the president of the Oscar Wilde Society, and I'm very interested in Oscar Wilde, that he's now viewed through the tragedy, the prism of his downfall. Actually, Oscar Wilde had 40 fabulous years before the pack of cards collapsed. Kenneth had a wonderful life and gave us so much joy. And what I should really be talking about is how he got me onto Just a Minute. It was he who introduced me to them and said, let's put him, and I'm 40 years later, I'm still doing the show. It was he who got me onto Countdown. He was there first. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he was all of those things.
I think you're right. It's easy to trip up into that trap where, because if we're talking about faith, if he had a faith, well, that means he was contemplative all the time and worried about it. actually it was an important part of his life because it brought him pleasure.
And it was a golden thread in his life, an easy golden thread. Now, we can discuss whether it really helped him in the end or not, but he certainly got great pleasure from the works of people like Philip Larkin, Houseman, the people he quoted. Faith was important, and it gave him the security. I'm not so sure that he was tormented about being gay. I don't know. We talked about it quite often because he was ready to support the campaign for homosexual equality, but he had reservations about going to too many meetings. You know, the love that dare not speak its name is now shouting the odds from the rooftops, he would say. He solved the problem for himself because after some fumblings, as he would call it, in the 1940s, he decided, actually, it's not for me. I am fastidious. So he spared himself that. So I think during his early years, he was quite comfortable in a way that, say, Stanley Baxter wasn't. Because Stanley also found happiness in his marriage, wanted a family. Gordon Jackson, these are his real best friends, was a happily married person. Kenneth wanted family. He wanted love. He wanted security. Faith gave him that. And towards the end, what we have to work out is, did faith let him down?
And when I met him, I remember the first meal where we were talking about, can you believe this? The Church of England was having a debate in Synod on homosexuality. Now, we've come such a long way since then, but he was very angry with the Church for its loud voice against, love as he saw it. And it was making him very disillusioned with the Church. Again, I don't think it was just because of this. He had a very strong sense that religion, he said about the Christianity, he said he needed the message, but he wasn't attracted by the way it's voiced. And he hated showy religion, hypocritical. He'd say, oh, hypocrites about the General Synod and that debate. Hated that, which is his Wesleyanism, I think. He wanted, and he used this image, I remember, I don't want a thermometer church, I want a thermostat. I don't want something just to take the temperature, I want to change it. So that sense of what's it all for if it can't love was very deep in him, and it made him very angry but also disillusioned in those times I saw him. And I think he was having serious questions about whether he believed it and whether it was helping him in those days.
One of the interesting clips, I think, was where he was talking about when he was pretending to be a monk in a sketch with somebody else. And how he was slightly uncomfortable with doing it, or in general with the lambasting of religion for a cheap laugh, and that his way around that, or his way to deal with that, was to send up a quick silent prayer of forgiveness. And I found that quite charming, but also that he, his politeness wouldn't allow him to, which you would expect a Kenneth Williams to be like, you shut your row, I'm not having that, and storm off. Actually, he was, politely, ha ha ha, and then sent up a prayer. And I just find that a very interesting, even some of the roles he took on, as you say, in whether it was a Carry On film or whatever, maybe some of those could have done with a slight prayer. But yeah, I just find it interesting that all through his life, it seemed that he was intent on forgiveness for any kind of misdemeanor, and if it was appeared to be lambasting faith and religion.
And one thing he said more than once, and I think you can hear it in that radio program, is that he was grateful to Christianity because it challenged him to, and this is the words he used, it challenged him to become bigger than we are in the present moment. to make himself, it makes you bigger somehow, a more capacious person. So when he was feeling positive about his faith, it was that sense that it was there to stretch you, to make your heart bigger. And he said he was very grateful to the Christian faith for doing that to him in a profession that might not always be encouraging you to do that. But I didn't hear so much of that gratitude in those last months, if I'm honest.
It's interesting, another way that he uses the word faith was in a clip there from 1983, which it was a programme called Comic Roots that he did for the BBC, where he talks about the act of faith that an actor makes in putting his hand out to an audience and hoping the audience grabs it, and taking that leap of faith nightly as an actor. Now, I'm not saying that he saw his personal religion in the same way as he saw his profession, but it's interesting that he uses the same word and that it seems to be about constantly hoping that the audience will grab that hand and not being sure that they will. And I think you hear this in a lot of actors who say, they'll say, even though they've been in the business 50 years, well, this could be the night where the audience turn their back. And so they need that reassurance. Kenneth uses the word often reciprocity. He uses that word a lot in terms of, reaching out and hoping that there's someone at the other end. And when you knew him, I think there were fewer and fewer people on the other end of the phone, along the corridor with his mother fading fast. And maybe that was part of his faith as well.
He was also a huge hypochondriac and was always complaining. When I was with him, he couldn't eat anything because he had a stomach ulcer. He only would eat fish. And there was such a to-do and a hoo-ha every time, a waiter came about, so always very aware of the body and its pains. Got his ailing anus. I used to talk about quite I can't sit down because of my ailing anus. And he would say this really loudly in a restaurant. Oh, dear me, because he did love being noticed.
He loved being noticed.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to see David Benson, we're going to hear from in a moment, is reviving his show about Kenneth Williams. And I'm hoping he's going to, in this show, do the scene he did before, which is imagining Kenneth in the Italian restaurant, and where it gets louder and louder and more impossible as the evening goes on. And he did have to jack up the volume over the years. The essential Kenneth Williams was there right from the beginning. But when you see him in the film clip of him in the scene with Olivier, you see a really nice performance, but he's in the presence of Olivier. As the years go by, the performance is just jacked up. It's just jacked up every way. I mean, love is always part, all the carry-ons. There was the love for the work of Charles Hawtrey. There was literally the love for Barbara Windsor. I mean, a real love for this human being. But towards the end, it had to get louder and louder. He was always insecure, but the insecurity became greater because there wasn't the reassurance. The last stage play he was in was a play called The Undertaking, very interesting, complicated play set in a funeral parlour. But there weren't the laughs. The audience came expecting laughs. What was he going to do? He had to jack the whole thing up. And so that's what he ended up doing, louder and louder. Didn't get the laugh first time round saying anus, so you said it a second time. Yeah. I noticed just then, that's the way it's done.
Exactly.
No, my anus, no. My problem with doing Kenneth is I end up as Frankie Howard. I look forward to coming to your Frankie Howard evening next year. No, missus, no.
But once he'd done that, Gyles, and he'd maybe managed to get the reaction that part of him craved, that's when he talks about going home, sitting by the bed and praying. So clearly this was part of his routine. And I think, maybe not towards the end, but for most of his life, the routine seemed to be prayers at night, thinking about what had happened during the day. And it was the next morning, after he'd had a good night's sleep, where he would write his diary of what had actually occurred the day before. So he'd spoken to God at night, and then in the morning recorded it in glorious black and white for us to read 50, 60 years later. Now, I've picked out a few diary entries of, relevant to what we're talking about, and I was going to read them out. But because we do have, as Gyles says, the great David Benson in the audience, who does a pretty smashing impression of Kenneth Williams, is David happy to come and read?
Oh, we are so lucky. Yeah.
Are you going to bless me?
No.
I want to say, if you enjoy David as you
gonna
will.
I'm going to hear your confession.
Oh, I see.
Oh, yeah.
I normally do it in private.
I haven't got time for that.
No, actually, I'm an actor. I confess in public.
David, I've marked them out.
Oh, I thought we were going to do this from your book. I'll be doing from your book.
There's a couple, but read them from his.
All right. Well, all right. Well, this is off the cuff, as it were.
Read us the great original.
Am I on? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's good.
1st of September 1954.
Can we hear him? No, they can't hear you at the back.
You can't hear me? You can't?
He's not
There
on.
am I. That mic.
Oh, we give him the roving mic.
David.
David, you can have a handheld.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
They all say that. I'll wait. Hang on, let me just do a little... Blimey. God help us. This is kind of being really wordy, isn't it?
I thought I'd make it a
This is a
challenge.
brand
for you.
new copy as well. I can tell the spine isn't broken. Wednesday, 1st of September, 1954. Right, so divinity, I believe, is obvious. To deny it is as futile as to deny oxygen. It is something fundamentally right and proper to the condition of men. But the forms which this divinity is observed should never become important in themselves. They should always be subordinate to the original concept and be dispensable according to the condition of humanity. Discuss. Well, why do you ask for that one?
Read the next one as well. The third.
No,
that one.
the third, sorry. Friday the 3rd of September. Human love in any manifestation never ceases to humble me. These earthly signs of divinity are noble signposts on the road to God.
Now, that is him as a 28-year-old.
Yeah.
That's him as a 28-year-old, talking quite seriously about human love and his relationship with God. Maybe not typical for someone of that age to be thinking along those lines, but it's quite typical for, I've found, sort of in the 50s. Those are the things that were playing on his mind. Perhaps surprisingly, I don't know. Maybe people think that all his life he was just a kind of, happy-go-lucky carry-oner. I don't think people do really think that. But I think that's an example of quite heavy, that's him in the morning, just having woken up writing that.
Well, of course, he was, as you may know, very, very influenced by my good Dr. Erich Heller, who was professor of
German studies at Swansea University.
He met him, I think, around about 1950. Hugely influenced his thinking, and you see many in his letters and diaries, and including here, I would say, suggestions that he's in a way rehearsing what he's learned from that book. And he's going to make a little theological statement here today, this morning. And so he writes beautifully these wonderful thoughts, which I think come a lot from Dr. Erich Heller's books, The Disinherited Mind and others, well worth a read.
And he read those books sort of every year for the rest of his life. He continually came back.
So do you think, Bill, there was this, I'm asking you a question now, but there was a certain kind of second-hand theology or second-hand knowledge that he was inheriting?
I think a lot of the things he said were things he'd learnt from either books he'd read or people he'd met.
Yes.
And he was very he was impressionable. And if he liked the cut of their jib, that he would take on their, and especially if they were a kind of father figure.
Yeah.
like I think Eric Heller in particular was an older man who, you know, and an older gay man as well, who he could sort of relate to in some ways, that he could talk to in a way that he could never talk to his father or anybody he really knew in his personal life. But he was obviously inflamed. His thought processes were inflamed by what these people said and wrote.
A diarist, though, is also always talking to themselves.
Yes.
And sometimes a diarist is talking to themselves because they've got no one else to talk to. And I think he is fascinating, but he's just a man. And I think we mustn't turn him into St. Augustine of Hippo, simply because he gives us a few sententious sentences. He did pick quite liberally from,
But I think that's the point, is that it's a bit of pick and mix of a belief system.
Yeah.
But I think that's what most people do, isn't it?
Exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He is like most people.
Could that be why, I wonder, as Gyles, you said, at the end it seemed that faith didn't really sustain him to the point where he was able to draw on it to stay alive?
That's the question we're asking tonight. I hadn't thought about it before. Did faith, as well as everybody else, let him down?
Well, I remember, I've never said this.
Think carefully. There's somebody from the Church Times, a rather earnest-looking young woman wearing glasses at the back.
I haven't said this, but on that first meeting, he said, he was talking about his stomach. He said, I've decided I'm going to do a Hancock.
Oh, he said that to you?
Yes, I'm going to do a Hancock.
Well,
and so I think, he did have these thoughts through his life, and maybe it was just a bad day, but that I came away concerned about, well, what am I supposed to do with that, or was it just a bit of histrionic? But he did say that, and I think his faith, like it does with all of us, I think, it ebbed and flowed, and it can even ebb and flow in a half-hour conversation. You can go from feeling that everything is somehow fitting. If you just take a step back, there's a pattern here which will speak of love being supreme and of worthy of pursuit, and perhaps ultimate reality can be trustworthy in some way. Can I put my trust in this? And then there are some times where you've ebbed out of that, and actually it's pretty despairing, and let me just listen to late Beethoven, which is what he wanted to do. And I think in a conversation, you could literally feel him going in and out of that internal dialogue, which frankly is just pretty human to me.
Well, isn't that the nature of faith?
Yes,
that it's not a certainty, it's a constant testing. I say this as someone who was brought up an atheist, by the way. But that's my understanding of what
I think we need to open it up to the audience
Sure.
before we see the final
I'll sit
clip
here.
because of time. Can I have that?
I'll just in case you need me, I'll
Yes. Can I take that? Of course. Thank you.
I feel like I'm being demoted.
you can hear, incidentally, if you can hear more of David with his extraordinary voice, because he's very kindly done my Rosebud podcast for a celebration of Kenneth, which is going out on Tuesday week, or the Tuesday after Kenneth.
17th, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's going out.
So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please keep it fairly concise. And we've heard a sermon already this week here, so we don't want too long comments, but concise questions, please. Yes, here.
There have been several mentions of Philip Larkin tonight and Kenneth's love for Larkin. How do you feel he might have reconciled Larkin's lack of faith with his own faith, and may that have been an issue towards the end of his life?
I don't have an answer to that. I'm afraid.
Shall I give a go?
Yeah, give it a go.
I think Larkin is a little bit ambiguous. There are signs in some of his poems that he wasn't as atheistic as some people think. One of his greatest friends, who he admired most, was Father Bowen in the local church in Hull. And he wrote this beautiful letter to him once after going to evensong and benediction in his church. And Larkin wrote to him, "I honour the things you do and bow down at the way you do them." that's not somebody who's deeply angry against God, that he was still willing to think about reverence, as he does in the famous poem Church-Going, where he takes off his cycle clips in awkward reverence in the church. And I think with Larkin, there is an awkward reverence that again ebbs and flows, but I think that's why it appealed to Williams. And there are certain poems, particularly The Mower by Larkin, where I think it's anything but a deep nihilistic view of the world. So I don't think Larkin is so easily pinpointed as some people think.
Kenneth, I think one of the ways he saw God was, as he put it, he's an understanding of God as truth, goodness, and beauty. And one of those beauties is the acts of art that people can create. And I think he loved the art and, by extension, the artist, whatever their beliefs.
Another question. Yes. Could you just wait for the microphone? It's just there. Okay, thanks.
Is there any evidence that he studied any other religions as sort of a background information?
Well, I was only going to say, I suspected maybe the clip you're going to show where he talks about his interaction with India with the officers.
No, that isn't that. Tell that story, David.
Well, this is his story. Sorry, it's the story he told about being an officer in India and offending the Sikh regiment and having to come up and basically apologise to them, and how he found it so incredibly uplifting and moving experience.
What he says was
that
he said a man of a different creed taught me the values of my own.
That's it.
When he was forgiven by this Hindu, I think it was, he'd been very rude to him, and he went up and he said, "Look, I was wrong there. I'm sorry." And this man very, very graciously, with a big smile, forgave him. And he said, "This man of another creed taught me the values of my own."
Yeah.
Whether he studied more, I don't know, but certainly he that moment was important to him. He saw the beauty of the diversity of those who were trying to respond to transcendent. Yeah. One more question, perhaps. Anybody? Yes. No.
Thank you. I was wondering whether you thought the diaries themselves were written just for him, or whether you thought there was one eye on some sort of posthumous publication and a sort of, I'm still here, I'm making a statement, and it's going to shock you.
I think there were different periods of his life where the diary had a different function. So at the very, very beginning, when he was 15, it was really just a record of how he was progressing as a student, and then as a draftsman. And then, I mean, to be honest, if you go and look at the real diary, a lot of what's left out of the published diaries are, especially sort of 1942, half of it is just where he writes uneventful across 5 days, because, you know, even if the war was on, not a lot was happening in Kenneth Williams' life when he was sort of, 16 or whatever. Later on, as the diaries physically got bigger in size, I mean, his very first diaries are tiny pocket diaries, sort of, and by the end of his life, they're huge desk diaries, a page to a day, and nearly every square inch is filled in different coloured inks, depending on what he was, the type of entry he was making. So red ink if it was a health-related issue. Obviously, you don't get that in a published book, but that's how specific he had become. And if you see, for example, an interview he did with Mavis Nicholson in 75 or 76, where she asks him, would you want the diaries published after your death? He was quite open to the idea of that. And that's, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Are people thinking while they're keeping their diary. Oh, after I'm dead, they'll love this line. I don't think it was to that extent, but I don't think it was against the idea of people putting the pieces together after he was out of the way, as he put it. If I'm out of the way, that's fine.
I think he did include some of his best lines for immortality. But I think also he was somebody whose moods changed. So he could say vicious things about somebody, and the next day he loves that person. So it reflects his personality.
Yeah. You see it a lot where he says, such and such isn't as bad as I thought. And where he's changed his mind, it's something he's done before.
If we're coming to the end, I'm going to say something to encourage you, Mark,
please.
as the brilliant dean, I have to say. You're brilliant, Britain's best dean outside of the Dean of Chester. You're absolutely, you're just extraordinary. You're marvellous. But I was thinking tonight, comparing and contrasting, that faith is marvellous. It's a wonderful thing if you can have faith. I knew this psychiatrist, Dr. Anthony Clare, and he showed me research that showed that people of faith, it doesn't need to be a Christian faith, but a line of life, a philosophy of life, and faith is the most obvious way of describing it. These people live happier and on the whole longer lives than people without faith. And I take, as I've written a biography of Elizabeth II, her straightforward faith, her absolutely straight down the line Church of England faith sustained her. She wrote her diary every evening in pencil, in case she needed to correct the spelling of a name in the morning, in pencil, before she said her prayers on her knees. And it was a simple diary, what happened today, and it was a diary of gratitude. That's all it was, thanking God for the day. That was her diary. Then she got into bed, having said the Lord's Prayer, and went to sleep. So a simple faith kept throughout your life. You lived to be 96 and die only 2 days after fulfilling your official duties. But if, unfortunately, you find there isn't as much love as you hoped, and your faith is a bit more complicated, and you write your diary like that, then you don't necessarily end so happily. But I'm so glad about your revelation, because it means that you feel as guilty as Michelle and I do. And it's wonderful to feel as guilty as your confessor.
Indeed. We're going to end now with the final clip, which would you like to just introduce?
Yeah, I think this is probably the first time it will have been seen in its entirety since it was first broadcast 50 years ago, on a series of programmes that were done for the BBC about Good Friday, about religion. And it's quite a serious clip about Kenneth just explaining what faith means to him, and it probably will bookend what we've talked about tonight.
Hi there. Unfortunately, we're unable to include the clip of Kenneth Williams in this podcast recording due to copyright restrictions. We apologise for the inconvenience caused and hope you enjoy the rest of the conversation.
So perhaps he was St. Augustine of Hippo
Yes,
after all.
indeed. Yes. Well, that is Kenneth Williams, perhaps as you've never seen him before. I need to bring us to a close. Here was a talented, adored actor and comedian who made many people laugh till the tears fell. Someone who helped us burst out of the prim and proper to relish the fun of life, but who at the same time deep down knew that this life is much more than a mere carry-on, and that sometimes we do need to stop messing about.
No.
As an actor, he knew that life asks us to pay attention, and if we do pay attention, it tends to pay us back. He once said that a fan club is ultimately a group of people who tell an actor he's not alone in the way he feels. And if so, I think he still has thousands of fans. Thank you for coming tonight, and would you please join me in thanking Gyles and Bill for their wonderful contributions.
Thank you, Mark. And David.